They said I failed. They told everyone I quit. They said it like a fact they'd memorized. I stand outside this military hearing room in plain clothes. No uniform, no escort. Just me and the weight of 20 years of silence pressing against my chest, like a held breath. The hallway smells like floor wax and old coffee. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of government beige that makes truth feel optional. My hands aren't shaking. They should be, maybe, but I've held steadier things than my own reputation in my palms. The door to my left is mahogany with brass fixtures. Behind it, voices rise and fall in military cadence. They're discussing my case, my alleged misconduct, my supposed failure to complete a mission that officially never happened. I check my watch. 13:47 hours. 3 minutes until they call my name. That's when I hear the footsteps, sharp, measured, the kind that make colonels straighten their spines without looking up. I don't turn around. I don't need to. 20 years in intelligence teaches you to read a room through sound alone. The footsteps slow, then stop. Wait. The voice cuts through the hallway chatter like a blade through silk. Every conversation dies. Every clipboard freezes mid-signature. You're the one from Kandahar. It's not a question, it's recognition, the kind that changes the temperature in a room. I turn slowly. General Thorne stands 3 feet away. His dress blues, perfect, his eyes sharp with something between surprise and respect. He's older than I remember. Gray at the temples now. But those eyes haven't changed. They're the same ones that looked at me across a sand-blown briefing tent 12 years ago when I handed him a folder that saved 37 lives. The hallway has gone completely silent. A captain near the water fountain drops his cup. It hits the floor with a hollow plastic sound that echoes off the walls like a gunshot. General, I say, not a question. Not a plea. Just acknowledgement. He steps closer, his voice drops, but not enough to be private. You were supposed to be dead. The words hang in the air like smoke. I see heads turning, whispers starting. A major I don't recognize pulls out his phone, then thinks better of it and puts it away. Reports of my death, I say quietly, were greatly exaggerated. Something shifts in his expression, not a smile exactly. More like the shadow of one. He nods once sharp and formal. Then he does something that makes my chest tighten. He salutes. Not the casual acknowledgement you give a fellow officer. The kind you give someone who earned it in ways that don't make it into citation ceremonies. The kind reserved for ghosts who turn out to be flesh and blood after all. I return it. My hand moves without conscious thought muscle memory, older than my doubts. Behind me, I hear a sharp intake of breath. I know that sound. It's my former commander, Colonel Martinez, the one who signed the complaint that brought me here. The one who's been telling people for 5 years that I cracked under pressure in Afghanistan. He's watching from the hearing room doorway now. His face has gone the color of old paper. General Thorne doesn't look at him. Doesn't look at anyone else, just me. They're waiting for you in there, he says. I know. You ready for this? I almost laugh. Ready. As if 12 years of silence and a family that erased me from their Christmas cards could prepare anyone for this moment. Sir, I say I've been ready since the day they decided I didn't exist. He steps aside. The path to the hearing room door stretches in front of me like a bridge I've been afraid to cross, but fear is just another kind of silence. And I'm done being quiet. I walk toward the door, my footsteps steady on the polished floor. Behind me, I hear someone whisper, "That's her. That's actually her. My name is Natalie Grant, middle child of the Grant family, daughter of a decorated logistics officer and a mother who ironed uniforms with more precision than emotion. My brother Ryan is a rising colonel. My sister Melissa is Navy Public Affairs, the family's shining voice. Me, I'm the one they stopped mentioning, the one who couldn't finish, the failure, the ghost. But what they never knew, what they never bothered to ask, is that I didn't leave the army. I was pulled, recruited, into something so silent I had to erase myself to serve it. For 10 years, I walked in shadows, not ashamed, just unlisted. If you're still listening, maybe this sounds familiar. Maybe someone rewrote your story before you had the chance to live it. Let me tell you mine, and if it brings up something and you drop a "still here" in the comments, Sometimes just knowing you're not invisible is enough to survive the silence. The one who's about to remind them why forgetting was their first mistake. I reach for the door handle. My reflection stares back at me from the brass nameplate. Hearing Room C, authorized personnel only. 12 years ago, they decided I wasn't authorized to exist. Time to change that. The Grant family Christmas table had 7 chairs. Every year. Same positions, same assignments, same unspoken hierarchy. Dad at the head in his pressed khakis, even on holidays. Mom to his right, her navy cross catching the light from the chandelier. Ryan across from her shoulders, squared like he was still at formation. Melissa beside him, animated and golden, the kind of person who made rooms feel warmer just by walking in. My chair was second from the left, was being the operative phrase. Because 3 Christmases ago, when I drove 8 hours through a December blizzard to make it home, I found a 12-year-old neighbor kid sitting in my spot. His parents were deployed, Mom explained, setting down another plate. We thought it would be nice. I stood in the doorway holding a bottle of wine and my service duffel, watching this kid cut into the prime rib that should have been mine. Nobody moved to make room. Nobody suggested we pull up another chair. There's space at the counter, Mom said, not looking at me. You don't mind, do you? You're always so flexible. Flexible. That's what they called it when you disappeared for months at a time and nobody asked where you'd been. I ate standing up by the kitchen sink, listening to Melissa tell stories about her latest Navy public affairs assignment. Something involving a destroyer christening and a senator's wife. Her voice carried that particular mix of confidence and charm that made admirals remember her name. The best part, she said, gesturing with her fork, is working with people who understand commitment. People who finish what they start. She didn't look at me when she said it. Didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. Ryan nodded along, cutting his meat with surgical precision. Takes real character to see something through, he agreed. Not everyone has that kind of backbone. I set my plate down harder than necessary. The sound echoed through the dining room like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read. Dad cleared his throat. Natalie's here now, he said. It wasn't quite a defense, more like an observation. That's what matters. But it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the empty space where my story should have been. The questions nobody asked. The assumptions they'd built into fact over 9 years of my absence. Because here's what they knew: Natalie Grant, middle child, washed out of officer candidate school in week 9. Couldn't handle the pressure. Couldn't finish what she started. Classic middle child syndrome. Not quite good enough to lead, not quite bad enough to matter. Here's what they didn't know. I didn't wash out. I was pulled. Week 9 of OCS, I was called into the commandant's office. Not for disciplinary action. Not for academic failure. For something they called exceptional psychological profiling results and demonstrated discretion under pressure. Translation: someone had been watching. Someone had noticed that while my classmates cracked under sleep deprivation and stress positions, I went quiet. Not broken quiet, strategic quiet. The kind that observes first and speaks when it matters. Grant, the colonel behind the desk, said, "How do you feel about work that doesn't come with parades?" I was 19. I thought he was talking about logistics or intelligence analysis, desk work, background support. I said yes because saying no to a colonel isn't really an option when you're 3 weeks away from commissioning. 24 hours later, I was on a plane to Virginia with a folder full of papers I couldn't discuss and a new chain of command I couldn't name. My OCS instructors were told I'd been dismissed for personal reasons. My family was told I couldn't cut it. The truth was simpler and more complicated. I'd been recruited for a black ops intelligence pipeline, so classified it didn't have an official designation. Just a number, just a need. For the next decade, I existed in the spaces between official records. I had a social security number and a driver's license, but no military personnel file that anyone with standard clearance could access. I had an apartment and a bank account, but my mail came through forwarding services with generic return addresses. I became the kind of person who could disappear from a family photo and leave no empty space, because officially I'd never been there to begin with. Ryan climbed the ranks with textbook precision. Citations and commendations, leadership courses, and strategic assignments. His career had a narrative arc you could follow on paper, a story that made sense to anyone who cared to read it. Melissa built her reputation on visibility. Press conferences and public events, naval ceremonies broadcast on C-SPAN. She was the family's voice, the one who could explain military life to civilian audiences with just the right mix of pride and humility. And me, I learned to move through the world like a ghost with a security clearance. I learned that some kinds of service don't come with recognition, and some kinds of sacrifice don't come with gratitude. The worst part wasn't the secrecy. It was how easily they accepted my absence, how quickly my silence became proof of my failure instead of evidence of my duty. Christmas dinner ended with Melissa raising her glass of wine, her cheeks flushed with warmth and accomplishment. To those who serve, she said, smiling at Ryan, at Dad, at Mom's old uniform hanging framed on the wall. To those who stayed and didn't quit. Everyone drank except me. My glass was empty and nobody offered to fill it. Later, washing dishes alone in the kitchen, I found a Christmas card addressed to the family tucked behind the coffee maker. It was from Colonel Martinez's dad's old commanding officer. Inside, he'd written, "Proud of your Ryan and Melissa, true examples of military excellence." My name wasn't mentioned, not even in passing. I dried the last plate and put it away, thinking about the mission I'd completed 3 months earlier. 18 hours in a bunker outside Damascus, coordinating extraction routes for a diplomatic team while artillery shells landed close enough to rattle my teeth. Nobody would ever know about that. Nobody would ever thank me for it. But the diplomats made it home alive, and sometimes that has to be enough, even when your own family thinks you're the one who gave up. The photograph is 3 inches by 4 inches, printed on standard military issue photo paper. The edges are worn soft from handling, and there's a coffee stain in the bottom right corner from a briefing room in Germany, where I first saw the mission files. In the photo, you can see the silhouette of a person crouched beside a concrete barrier. The image is grainy, taken with night vision equipment, during what the timestamp says was 03 for 7 hours. Behind the figure, you can make out the angular shadows of a compound wall and the faint outline of mountains against a star-scattered sky. The figure is me. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. March 15th, 7 years ago. The photo has no official caption, no mission designation, no record number stamped in the corner. It exists in my desk drawer, like evidence of a crime that was never committed, proof of a story that was never supposed to be told. But tonight, with that hearing room door still echoing in my memory and General Thorne's recognition still burning in my chest, maybe it's time to break the silence that's been choking me for 7 years. Operation Dusk Lantern. That wasn't its real name. Real operations in my line of work don't get names, just numbers and classification levels that make filing clerks nervous. But every mission needs something to call it when you're lying awake at 3 a.m. and Dusk Lantern fit the way it felt. Like trying to hold light in your hands while everything around you went dark. The briefing came on a Tuesday. I was in Bagram finishing up an intelligence assessment on supply route vulnerabilities when a colonel I'd never seen before walked into my workspace and said 4 words, "Grab your kit, Grant." 30 minutes later, I was in a helicopter flying south with 3 men whose names I never learned. We didn't make small talk. We didn't compare mission histories. We just sat in the vibrating dark and checked our equipment with the kind of methodical precision that comes from knowing you might not get a second chance to get it right. The target wasn't a high-value enemy compound. It wasn't a weapons cache or a strategic position. It was a school. A girls' school in a village 40 miles outside Kandahar, where 12 people, teachers, students, 1 village elder who'd been advocating for female education, were being held by a cell that had decided to make an example of what happened when you challenged their vision of order. The intelligence was solid but narrow. We knew where they were. We knew roughly how many hostiles were inside. We knew that every hour we waited increased the chances that those 12 people would become a message written in blood. What we didn't know was that the cell had been expecting us. I was the intel lead, which meant I was responsible for everything we couldn't see coming. Communications intercepts, structural assessments, extraction route planning. My job was to think 3 moves ahead, while the shooters focused on the move in front of them. The compound was smaller than the satellite images suggested. 2 buildings connected by a covered walkway surrounded by a wall that was more psychological barrier than physical defense. No guards visible from our position, which should have been the first red flag. We went in at dawn. Not because dawn was tactically optimal, but because we'd intercepted communications suggesting the executions were scheduled for sunrise prayers. Sometimes the mission timeline chooses you. Marcus Reeves took point. He was a staff sergeant from North Carolina who kept photos of his twin daughters taped inside his helmet. Behind him, Tommy Chen moved like he was born in tactical gear. Every step calculated, every breath controlled. I stayed back with communications equipment and backup ammunition, coordinating with our extraction helicopter and monitoring enemy radio chatter. My job was to be the voice in their earpieces, the one who could see the bigger picture while they handled the immediate threat. The first building was empty. The second held 9 of the 12 hostages, bound but alive. The other 3 were in the walkway between buildings, being used as human shields by 4 hostiles who had been waiting for exactly this moment. That's when the decision became mine. Standard protocol was to wait for backup, establish a perimeter, negotiate. But the intercepted communications had been clear. Sunrise prayers were in 11 minutes. The hostiles weren't planning to negotiate. They were planning to broadcast an execution. I had 11 minutes to choose between following procedure and saving lives. I chose the lives. The plan I called over the radio was surgical and desperate in equal measure. Marcus would create a distraction from the east. Tommy would breach from the south. I would provide cover fire and coordinate their movements, while our helicopter pilot repositioned for immediate extraction. It worked mostly. We got all 12 hostages out alive. 3 teachers, 7 students between the ages of 14 and 19, 1 village elder who kept thanking us in broken English, and 1 8-year-old girl who hadn't spoken since the ordeal began. But Marcus Reeves didn't make it to the extraction point. Neither did Tommy Chen. The after-action report was 3 pages long and classified at a level that required special storage protocols. It concluded that the mission was a tactical success with acceptable losses. Acceptable losses. As if the weight of 2 men's lives could be calculated on a spreadsheet. I never received a medal. The mission was never declassified. The 12 people we saved went back to their lives, and officially none of it ever happened. But I kept the photograph. The one that shows my silhouette against the compound wall, taken by some piece of surveillance equipment that was supposed to record everything and remember nothing. The silence that followed wasn't just military protocol. It was a 10-year non-disclosure agreement that made discussing the mission a federal crime. It was protecting sources who were still operating in the region. It was protecting families of the hostages who would become targets if their rescue became public knowledge. It was protecting myself from a family who had already decided I was a failure, who might not understand that some victories don't come with ceremony. For 7 years, I carried that silence like a stone in my chest. Every Christmas dinner where they toasted those who served with honor. Every time Ryan mentioned his latest commendation or Melissa talked about her public affairs triumphs. They measured service and visibility in recognition in stories that could be told at cocktail parties and reunion dinners. I measured it in 12 people who were still alive, in Marcus Reeves's daughters, who would grow up knowing their father died for something that mattered even if they never knew what, in Tommy Chen's parents who received a flag and a medal, and the knowledge that their son's sacrifice was classified but significant. The photograph is still in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and remember that night. Remember the weight of the radio in my hand and the sound of the helicopter rotors, and the moment when we knew everyone was going to make it out except the 2 who wouldn't. Tonight, for the first time in 7 years, I'm going to tell someone about Operation Dusk Lantern. Not because I need recognition, not because I want credit, because some stories are too important to die in silence, even when silence was supposed to keep them alive. The official summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who waited while I signed for it with hands that didn't shake. The envelope was Department of Defense standard, white thick with my name typed in block letters across the front. No return address, no indication of what waited inside. I opened it standing in my kitchen, my coffee growing cold on the counter. You are hereby summoned to appear before a closed military hearing regarding your involvement in Operation Dusk Lantern, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. 1400 hours, Thursday, November 18th. 7 years. 7 years of silence, and now someone wanted to talk. The letter was signed by Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a name I didn't recognize. Below her signature was a case number and a classification level that made my chest tighten. This wasn't routine. This wasn't administrative cleanup. This was someone with access to files that weren't supposed to exist asking questions about a mission that had never officially happened. I read the summons 3 times, looking for clues in the bureaucratic language. Regarding your involvement could mean anything: recognition, investigation, court-martial. With military legal documents, the scariest possibilities often hide behind the politest words. I was still staring at the paper when my phone chimed. New email, personal account. The sender was a string of random letters and numbers. No subject line. The message itself was 2 sentences and an attachment. Some truths deserve to see daylight. You might find this interesting. The attachment was a PDF scan of a military complaint form, DA Form 1559, the kind used for reporting suspected misconduct. It was dated 4 years ago, but the signature line was blank. A draft that had never been submitted, never processed, never acted upon, but someone had kept it. The complaint alleged that Staff Sergeant Natalie Grant had exceeded her authority during a classified operation in Kandahar province, resulting in unnecessary casualties and potential compromise of operational security. It cited reckless decision-making under pressure and failure to follow established protocols. The specifics were wrong. The timeline was off. But the core details, the compound, the hostages, the Dawn extraction, were accurate enough to make my blood run cold. Someone had taken pieces of the truth and twisted them into something ugly. Someone had turned a successful rescue mission into evidence of misconduct, had transformed the decision that saved 12 lives into proof of incompetence. The worst part was how believable it sounded. How easy it would be for someone reading this complaint to see exactly what they expected to see: another intelligence officer who had cracked under pressure, who had made bad decisions and gotten people killed. I checked the email metadata, but the sender had covered their tracks. Encrypted, routing anonymous servers, the kind of digital camouflage that takes real skill to maintain. This wasn't some random troublemaker with a grudge. This was someone who knew how to move information without leaving fingerprints. The timing wasn't coincidental, the summons and the email arriving on the same day, the complaint surfacing, just as someone was asking official questions about Dusk Lantern. Someone was building a narrative, setting up dominoes to fall in a very specific pattern. But why now? After 7 years of silence, after successfully burying a mission that was supposed to stay buried, why drag it back into the light? I poured my cold coffee down the sink and started making a list of who had access to the original mission files. The number was smaller than I'd expected. 3 people in the chain of command, 2 intelligence analysts, 1 communications officer, and whoever had handled the classification review. One of those people had decided to weaponize my silence. I pulled out my old military credentials from the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. The ID card looked strange in the afternoon light. Younger face, sharper edges, the kind of confidence that comes from not yet knowing what you're capable of losing. Next to the credentials was the photograph from Kandahar. My silhouette against the compound wall, proof of presence at a mission that officially never happened. I'd carried it for 7 years like a talisman, like evidence that my sacrifice had mattered, even when no one could acknowledge it. Now it might be the only thing standing between me and a court-martial built on lies. I drove to Fort Belvoir through November rain that turned the world gray and uncertain. The windshield wipers kept time with my heartbeat, steady and insistent. In the passenger seat, my old credentials and the Kandahar photograph sat in a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should. Whoever had sent that email, whoever was turning my classified service into ammunition for their own agenda, they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I would stay quiet. They'd assumed that 7 years of silence meant I'd forgotten how to fight. But some battles choose their own timing, and this one had been waiting long enough. The gates of Fort Belvoir rose ahead of me through the rain, and for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't driving away from my story. I was driving toward it. Standing outside that hearing room door, I could hear my father's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me instead of 300 miles away in his retirement home in North Carolina. Without a uniform, no one remembers your name. He'd said it to me the day I came home from my abbreviated OCS experience, when I was still trying to figure out how to explain why I'd been pulled from officer training without being able to explain anything at all. I was sitting at the kitchen table in civilian clothes, jeans and a college sweatshirt that suddenly felt like a costume. and he looked at me with the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than anger. Military service is about visibility. He'd continued folding his newspaper with the precision he brought to everything. It's about showing up in uniform, being present, being counted. Without that structure, without that identity, you're just civilian. The way he'd said that last word, civilian, like it was a diagnosis of some terminal condition. I'd wanted to tell him that some service requires invisibility, that some uniforms are made of shadows and silence, that sometimes being counted means never being seen. But the NDA was already in effect, and the weight of classified obligation was already settling on my shoulders like a second skin. So I'd said nothing, and he'd taken my silence as confirmation of his worst assumptions. Melissa had been more direct, of course. Last Christmas, when her Navy public affairs colleague had asked what I did for work, she'd waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, Natalie works in civilian admin. Nothing too exciting." Civilian admin. Like I filed paperwork and answered phones somewhere forgettable, somewhere that didn't matter. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood while Melissa was coordinating press releases about naval exercises. I was coordinating intelligence that kept those exercises from becoming actual combat operations. While she was managing the story of military strength, I was ensuring there would still be a military strong enough to have stories about. But she wore the uniform, and I didn't. She had the rank and the recognition and the clear narrative that made sense to everyone who heard it. I had silence and shadows and a photograph no one was supposed to see. Standing in that Fort Belvoir hallway, listening to the murmur of voices behind the hearing room door, I felt the weight of 7 years' worth of invisibility pressing down on me like atmospheric pressure, the kind that makes your ears pop and your chest ache. I was checking my watch, 13:58 hours, 2 minutes until they called my name, when I heard the footsteps, sharp, measured, authoritative. The kind that make junior officers check their posture without thinking about it. I didn't turn around, didn't need to. Some sounds carry their own identification, but when the footsteps slowed, then stopped, I felt the air in the hallway change. Conversations quieted. Papers stopped rustling. Someone's coffee cup clinked against a saucer and went silent. Wait, the voice cut through the institutional quiet, like a command no one had expected to hear. "You're the one from Kandahar." Not a question. Recognition. The kind that changes the temperature in a room and makes everyone suddenly aware they're witnesses to something significant. I turned slowly, my heart steady in my chest, and met General Thorne's eyes. He was older than I remembered, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent making decisions that kept other people awake at night. But those eyes were the same ones that had looked at me across a sand-blown briefing tent when I'd handed him intelligence that saved lives. The hallway had gone completely still. A captain near the water fountain had frozen mid-reach. 2 aides by the elevator had stopped their conversation and were staring with the kind of curiosity that comes from witnessing something they don't quite understand but know is important. One of them whispered, barely audible, "That's her." I felt 20 years of invisibility crack open like an eggshell, 20 years of being erased, dismissed, forgotten, reduced to cautionary tales and casual insults. 20 years of carrying silence like a burden instead of wearing it like armor. General Thorne was still looking at me, waiting. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready for. I didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't justify or defend or elaborate. I just nodded. Once, clean, definitive. Then I turned toward the hearing room door, reached for the handle, and walked into the room where my silence was finally going to find its voice. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected. Conference table for 12 American flag in the corner, and windows that looked out onto a courtyard where junior officers were conducting what looked like a training exercise. Normal. Bureaucratic. The kind of room where careers end with the scratch of a pen on official letterhead. 3 officers sat behind the table, Colonel Sarah Mitchell in the center, the woman whose signature had been on my summons. To her left, a major I didn't recognize, his uniform so crisp it looked like he'd put it on in the parking lot. To her right, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, whose name I knew from intelligence briefings, but whose face I was seeing for the first time. And at the far end of the table, looking like he'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen him, was Colonel Martinez, my former commander, the man who had filed the original incident report after Kandahar, who had signed off on the mission parameters, who had told me personally that my decisions in the field were sound and necessary. He wasn't meeting my eyes. Staff Sergeant Grant, Colonel Mitchell began, her voice neutral in the way that military lawyers perfect. Thank you for appearing today. We're here to discuss allegations that have recently come to light regarding Operation Dusk Lantern. She opened a folder and removed a copy of the complaint I'd seen in the anonymous email. The same twisted version of events, the same half-truths, dressed up as official concerns. Colonel Martinez, as the commanding officer during the operation in question, would you like to review these allegations? Martinez shifted in his chair. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than I remembered. The allegations suggest that Staff Sergeant Grant exceeded her authority and made tactical decisions that resulted in unnecessary casualties. He paused, swallowed. The complaint questions whether proper protocols were followed. Colonel Mitchell nodded. And in your assessment, were proper protocols followed? That's when Martinez looked at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. His eyes were the color of regret. He started, stopped, started again. At the time, the mission was classified as a success. All objectives were met. Hostages were recovered alive. That wasn't the question, Colonel. The silence stretched like a wire under tension. I could hear the training exercise in the courtyard. Voices calling cadence boots, hitting pavement in perfect rhythm. The sound of military order proceeding as scheduled, while my career hung in the balance of one man's willingness to tell the truth. That's when the door opened. General Thorne entered without ceremony, no aide announcing him, no fanfare. Just a two-star general walking into a room and changing its entire atmosphere. The three officers behind the table stood so quickly, their chairs scraped against the floor. General Cart, you are. Colonel Mitchell said, clearly caught off guard. We weren't expecting. Colonel Martinez contacted me yesterday, General Thorne said, taking a seat at the table without being invited. He thought I might have relevant testimony regarding Operation Dusk Lantern. Martinez's face had gone pale, but he was sitting straighter now. Like the arrival of someone with more stars, had reminded him who he used to be. General Thorne opened his own folder, thicker than the others with classification stamps I could see even from across the table. I was the regional intelligence coordinator during the time period in question, he said. I authorized the mission parameters. I reviewed the after-action reports. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that Staff Sergeant Grant's actions were not only within protocol, they were exemplary. He looked directly at me. The decision to breach immediately, rather than wait for backup, saved the lives of 12 hostages, who would have been executed within minutes. The tactical coordination required to extract those hostages while minimizing casualties was textbook precision under impossible circumstances. Colonel Mitchell cleared her throat. General, the complaint suggests that unauthorized risks were taken. The complaint, General Thorne interrupted, is based on incomplete information and appears to have been written by someone who wasn't present during the operation. His voice carried the kind of authority that ends discussions. I was present. I know what happened. He turned to me. Staff Sergeant Grant, would you like to address this panel? I stood slowly. 7 years of silence had taught me the power of choosing your words carefully, of making every syllable count. I didn't save 12 people for applause, I said. I did it because someone had to. I reached into my manila envelope and removed the photograph. The one showing my silhouette against the compound wall timestamp, clearly visible mountains of Kandahar province in the background. I placed it on the table where everyone could see it. This was taken during the operation. I was there. I made the decisions that needed to be made. People lived because of those decisions. I looked at each officer in turn. That's not an allegation. That's not a complaint. That's just what happened. The room went quiet, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence that had preceded General Thorne's arrival. This was different, heavier. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they're in the presence of something they need to respect rather than judge. Colonel Mitchell studied the photograph for a long moment. This operation was classified at the highest levels. How do we verify? You don't, General Thorne said simply. You trust the word of soldiers who were willing to risk their lives for people they'd never met in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, for reasons that can't be discussed in open court. He stood straightening his uniform jacket. This hearing is concluded. And just like that, 7 years of silence found its ending. The base quarters they assigned me were standard military temporary housing. Single-bed metal desk, fluorescent light that hummed like a trapped insect. I'd stayed in hundreds of rooms just like it over the years, anonymous spaces designed for people passing through, rather than people putting down roots. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a place where I could finally think clearly without 7 years of silence pressing against my temples. I opened my laptop and pulled up the anonymous email that had started this whole chain of events. The message itself was simple, but digital communications always carry more information than their senders realize. Metadata is like DNA for electronic correspondence, unique, traceable, and almost impossible to completely scrub. The email routing showed a path through 3 encrypted servers, but the originating IP address was still embedded in the header data. It took me 20 minutes to trace it back through the proxy chains to its source. Melissa's laptop. I stared at the screen for a full minute, waiting for the information to rearrange itself into something that made sense. Melissa, who had called me a failure at Christmas dinner. Melissa, who had toasted those who stayed and didn't quit while I ate standing up by the kitchen sink. Melissa, who had spent years treating me like a cautionary tale about military service gone wrong. She had sent the email that nearly destroyed my career, but also the one that had ultimately led to my vindication in General Thorne's hearing room. The irony was so sharp, it cut. I closed the laptop and drove to Norfolk, where Melissa was stationed at the Naval Public Affairs Support Office. The drive took 3 hours through Virginia countryside that looked like November felt, gray bare, stripped down to essentials. I found her in her office at 1900 hours, still in uniform, still working. She looked up when I knocked on her door frame, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition of an inevitable moment finally arriving. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," she said. No denial, no deflection, just acknowledgement, which was somehow worse than if she'd tried to lie. I sat down across from her desk without being invited. Why, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. For the first time in years, she looked at me without the careful distance she usually maintained, without the protective layer of professional competence that made her untouchable. "You weren't going to tell them," she said quietly. "You were just going to let them keep thinking you were a failure, let them keep treating you like you didn't matter." I didn't respond. Didn't trust myself to speak yet. I thought. She paused, struggling with words in a way I'd never seen before. Melissa was Navy Public Affairs. Words were her weapon of choice, her tool of trade. Watching her fumble for the right ones was like watching a sniper miss an easy shot. I thought maybe if they saw it, if someone official started asking questions about Kandahar, they'd finally see you. Really see you, not just the story they'd built about you. The words hit me like a physical blow. 7 years of thinking my sister despised me, of believing she saw me as nothing more than a family embarrassment, and all this time she'd been trying to save me from my own silence. "I didn't want to hurt you," she continued, her voice getting smaller. "I wanted them to recognize you. I wanted Dad to stop looking disappointed every time your name came up. I wanted Mom to stop making excuses for why you weren't at family events. I wanted Ryan to stop acting like you'd never existed." I felt something crack open in my chest, not breaking exactly. More like a wall I'd built around my heart, developing its first hairline fracture. "Melissa." "I know it was stupid," she said, cutting me off. "I know I should have talked to you first. But you never talk to any of us, not really. You just show up and disappear and leave us all wondering what we did wrong." The room went quiet except for the hum of her computer and the distant sounds of the naval base winding down for the evening. I was processing what she'd said, trying to reconcile this version of events with the narrative I'd been carrying for years. But something nagged at me. Something about the email, about the timing, about the precision of the information it contained. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my screenshots of the email metadata. "Melissa, what time did you send this?" She blinked. "What, the email? The timestamp shows 2:11 a.m. That's pretty late for you." She looked confused. "I don't remember exactly. I was working late trying to figure out how to word it so it wouldn't sound like I was attacking you." I kept scrolling through the data. The date was November 14th, Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning. Okay, You were in Singapore that week. The Pacific Fleet Communications Conference. The color drained from her face. What? I showed her my phone screen. The email was sent from your laptop at 2:11 a.m. Eastern Time. But you were in Singapore, which would have made it 3:11 p.m. Singapore time, middle of the conference day. She stared at the screen, then looked up at me with something like fear in her eyes. Natalie, I didn't send that email. And just like that, the carefully constructed narrative I'd been building in my head for the past 6 hours collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Someone else had used her laptop. Someone else had access to her files, her email account, her digital identity. Someone else had been playing both of us from the beginning. The Norfolk Naval Base has a 24-hour computer lab for personnel working on classified communications. Melissa's clearance got us access, and her growing panic motivated her to stay, while I dug deeper into her laptop's access logs. I changed my passwords every 90 days, she kept saying, pacing behind my chair. I use two-factor authentication. I never leave it unattended. But computer security is only as strong as the weakest human element, and family members sharing the same network during holiday visits create vulnerabilities that no password can prevent. I found it in the remote access logs. A VPN connection that had piggybacked onto Melissa's laptop during Christmas 3 years ago. The same Christmas where I'd eaten standing up by the kitchen sink, where I'd watched my seat given to a neighbor's kid, where Melissa had made her toast about people who stayed and didn't quit. The VPN signature was military issue assigned to active duty personnel for secure communications when working from non-military locations. The user ID was a standard format last name first initial service number. Grant.R2847593. Ryan. I stared at the screen until the letters stopped making sense and started making a different kind of sense. The kind that explained why my own brother had been able to access classified information about a mission he was never supposed to know existed. That's impossible, Melissa said when I showed her the screen. Ryan doesn't have that kind of clearance. He's logistics, not intelligence. But I was remembering things now. Details I'd filed away as insignificant at the time, patterns I'd been too close to see clearly. Ryan at family gatherings, always quiet when my name came up in conversation. Not just disinterested, strategically silent. The kind of silence that comes from having information you're not supposed to possess. Ryan avoiding eye contact during those same conversations, his attention suddenly absorbed by his phone or his food or anything else in the room. I'd thought it was indifference, maybe embarrassment at having a sister who'd failed at military service. But indifference doesn't require that kind of effort. Embarrassment doesn't need such careful choreography. Guilt does. I pulled up the original complaint draft, the one that had been used to weaponize my classified service. The language was too precise, too familiar with intelligence protocols for someone outside the community. But more than that, it contained details that had only been included in one specific after-action report. The report that had been sent to 3 people, me, General Thorne, and 1 liaison officer who had been tasked with coordinating logistics support for future similar operations. Ryan had been that liaison officer. 10 years ago, when Operation Dusk Lantern was being planned, the mission had required coordination between intelligence assets and supply chain management. Someone who could ensure that equipment and personnel could be moved quickly and quietly without leaving paper trails that might compromise operational security. Ryan had been selected for that role based on his logistics background and his security clearance. He'd been read into the mission at the operational level, not the tactical details, but enough to understand what was at stake, which meant he'd known for 10 years exactly what I'd done in Kandahar. He'd known about the hostages, about Marcus Reeves and Tommy Chen, about the decision I'd made that saved 12 lives. He'd known, and he'd said nothing, while our family treated me like a failure. Why would he do this, Melissa asked, and I could hear her struggling to reconcile the brother she thought she knew with the evidence on her laptop screen. I closed my eyes and remembered a conversation from 15 years ago. Ryan and I were both home on leave, both in our dress uniforms for some family event. We'd been standing in the backyard and he'd been talking about his career plans, his ambitions, his certainty that he was destined for command positions. General Thorne is coming to Fort Campbell next month, he'd said. He's looking for junior officers for some kind of special assignment. High-level stuff. Could be my ticket to the fast track. I'd wished him luck. Meant it too. 2 weeks later, I'd received orders to report to a classified briefing. General Thorne had been there along with 2 other officers whose names I'd never learned. They'd asked me questions about psychological resilience, about my ability to make decisions under pressure, about my comfort with operating in moral gray areas. I'd answered honestly, never knowing that Ryan had been asked the same questions earlier that week. I'd been selected. He hadn't. I'd been pulled into the Black Ops intelligence pipeline that had defined the next decade of my life. He'd been sent back to logistics, to the conventional career path he'd been following ever since. I'd never known he'd been considered. He'd never mentioned being passed over. But resentment doesn't need acknowledgement to grow. Sometimes it feeds on silence, on assumptions, on the gap between what someone thinks they deserve and what they actually receive. For 10 years, Ryan had watched me disappear into classified assignments while he managed supply chains and equipment inventories. He'd known I was serving in ways that mattered, in ways that saved lives, while our family dismissed me as a quitter. And instead of defending me, instead of finding a way to honor my service without compromising operational security, he'd chosen to use my silence against me. He'd taken the complaint draft that Melissa had written but never sent, probably found it in her documents during one of his Christmas visits, and turned it into a weapon designed to destroy what was left of my reputation. Not because he thought I'd done anything wrong in Kandahar, because he'd never forgiven me for being chosen when he wasn't. "We need to call him," Melissa said. I shook my head. "No, we need to be smarter than that." Because Ryan had spent 10 years watching and waiting for the right moment to use my own service against me. He'd been patient, careful, methodical, but he'd made one mistake. He'd assumed that silence meant weakness, that invisibility meant vulnerability. He was about to learn the difference. The report took me 3 days to write, not because the evidence was complicated. The digital trail Ryan had left was clear enough for any competent investigator to follow. VPN logs, access timestamps, metadata signatures, the kind of breadcrumb path that leads inevitably from question to answer. It took 3 days because I kept stopping to stare at the cursor blinking on my screen, thinking about what this document would do to my brother's career once I hit send. 23 pages of technical analysis and supporting documentation, enough to end everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, everything he thought he deserved but had never quite been able to earn. I could have sent it to the Inspector General's office with a request for full investigation and public accountability. I could have copied General Thorne, Colonel Martinez, anyone with enough rank to ensure that Ryan's betrayal became part of his permanent record. I could have done what he'd tried to do to me, weaponize the truth in service of justice. Instead, I sent it to Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Davis at Internal Security, with a cover letter that was shorter than any classified report I'd ever written. "Colonel Davis, please find attached evidence of unauthorized access to classified intelligence materials. The subject appears to have used his position and clearance to obtain information he was not authorized to possess, and subsequently use that information in a manner inconsistent with operational security protocols. I request that this matter be handled with appropriate discretion. I am not here to ruin careers. I'm here to restore the truth. Staff Sergeant Natalie Grant." I hit send at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, sitting in my apartment kitchen with cold coffee and the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stopped carrying weight you were never meant to bear alone. The response came 18 hours later, not from Colonel Davis, but from General Thorne. "Grant, can you be at Fort Belvoir tomorrow at 1100? There are some things we need to discuss." Thorne. I drove through another November morning past the same Virginia countryside that had witnessed my first trip to confront this mess. But everything felt different now, lighter. Not because the problem was solved, but because I'd finally chosen to trust the system I'd served instead of trying to protect everyone from the consequences of their own actions. General Thorne was waiting in the same conference room where my hearing had taken place 5 days earlier. This time, Colonel Davis was with him, a woman in her early 50s, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing and forgot less. "Sergeant Grant," General Thorne said, "your report was very thorough." I sat down across from them without ceremony. "Sir, Colonel Davis has conducted a preliminary investigation based on your findings. The evidence is conclusive." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your brother accessed classified materials without authorization and used information from those materials to file a false complaint designed to damage your service record." I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say that the evidence hadn't already said more clearly. Colonel Davis leaned forward. Under normal circumstances, this would result in criminal charges: unauthorized access to classified materials, misuse of government computer systems, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. But General Thorne continued, "Your request for discretion has been noted, and frankly pursuing this case to its full legal conclusion would require declassifying operational details that need to remain protected." I understood. Ryan's betrayal existed in the same classified shadows that had hidden my service for 10 years. Exposing one would compromise the other. "What happens to him?" I asked. "Colonel Grant will be reassigned to a logistics coordination position at Fort Drum," Colonel Davis said. "Administrative role, no command authority, no access to operational intelligence, no pathway to promotion above his current rank." Fort Drum, upstate New York. About as far from the centers of military power as you could get while still technically serving. Not exile exactly, but not advancement either. "He'll keep his rank," General Thorne added. "Keep his pension eligibility, but his career progression ends here." It was a surgical solution. Ryan would understand immediately what had happened and why, but no one else would need to know the details. He'd spend the rest of his military service processing supply requisitions and wondering what might have been if he'd chosen honor over resentment. "There's one more thing," Colonel Davis said. She slid a folder across the table. "Your service record has been updated to reflect your actual assignments and clearance levels. Obviously, operational details remain classified, but your personnel file now accurately represents your time in service." I opened the folder. Inside was a DD-214 that looked nothing like the one I'd been carrying for years. This one listed deployments to locations I couldn't have named publicly, commendations I'd never known I'd received, training certifications that reflected the real scope of my expertise. At the bottom in the section for awards and decorations was something I'd never expected to see: Bronze Star Medal with Valor device for actions during classified operations in Afghanistan. "That's retroactive to your service in Kandahar," General Thorne said quietly. "It should have been processed years ago, but the classification level made it complicated." I stared at the document for a long moment. Not because I needed the recognition. I'd learned to find my worth in places that didn't require external validation. But because it meant someone had been paying attention. Someone had been keeping score even when I thought no one was watching. "Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sergeant, for your service, and for giving us the chance to do the right thing even when it would have been easier to do nothing." I drove home through the same November landscape. But this time, I wasn't running from anything or toward anything. I was just moving forward and carrying exactly the weight I was supposed to carry, nothing more and nothing less. That evening, I called Melissa. "It's done," I said when she answered. "What happens now? Now we figure out how to be a family again." I called them on a Wednesday. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas, not for anyone's birthday or promotion or retirement. Just Wednesday evening in November, the kind of ordinary day that doesn't come with expectations or traditions or carefully rehearsed conversations. "I'm making dinner at the old house," I told each of them separately. "Sunday at 6. I have something to say." Mom asked if she should bring anything. I told her just herself. Dad wanted to know if this was about Ryan's reassignment. News of his transfer to Fort Drum had reached the family, though, without the details that mattered. I told him we'd talk Sunday. Melissa asked if I was okay. I told her I was better than okay, which was true in ways I was still learning to understand. Ryan didn't ask anything, just said he'd be there, his voice careful and measured like someone who'd been expecting this call for weeks. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Same beige walls, same tired furniture, same framed photographs, documenting a family history that had written me out of its narrative. But standing in the kitchen where I'd once eaten Christmas dinner by the sink, I realized the house hadn't changed. I had. They arrived together, which surprised me, unified front maybe. Or maybe just the practical coordination of people who'd spent years navigating around an absence they'd never bothered to understand. Mom brought flowers anyway, yellow chrysanthemums that she arranged in a vase, without being asked, the way she'd done for every family gathering since I was a child. Dad wore his weekend uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt with a military logo. Melissa looked nervous. Ryan looked like he was attending his own court-martial. I'd made pot roast. Nothing fancy, nothing that required conversation or complicated coordination. Just food that would stay warm while I said what I needed to say. We sat around the same table where I'd been erased from Christmas 3 years ago. This time I took Dad's chair at the head, not as a challenge, but as a claim. This was my house tonight, my table, my conversation. You believed I quit, I said without preamble. No small talk, no easing into difficult topics, just truth served at the proper temperature. You believed I failed? And no one asked why I disappeared. Mom's hands stilled on her napkin. Dad's eyes found a spot on the wall behind my head. Melissa was looking at me with something that might have been relief. Ryan was looking at his plate. For 10 years you built a story about me. The sister who couldn't cut it. The daughter who gave up. The middle child who just faded away. I paused not for effect, but because some truths need room to breathe before the next ones can be spoken. You never asked where I went. You never wondered what I was doing. You just decided I was gone, and you moved on. We didn't know, Mom started. You didn't ask, I said, not unkindly, but without compromise. There's a difference. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the photograph from Kandahar. The one that had been my secret proof of existence for 7 years. I placed it on the table where everyone could see it. Now you know, I never left. I just did the work in places where no one was watching. The room went quiet except for the sound of the heating system cycling on and the distant hum of traffic on the base. Normal sounds. Life continuing while truth rearranged itself around the dinner table. I slid the photograph across to Melissa. This is what I was doing while you were giving toasts about people who stay and don't quit. She picked it up with careful fingers, studying the grainy image like she was trying to memorize it. This is you, Kandahar province. 7 years ago, 12 people went home alive because I was there. Dad leaned forward to look at the photograph, his expression changing as he processed what he was seeing. Jesus, Natalie, we didn't know. I couldn't tell you, but you could have asked. Mom's eyes were bright with unshed tears. We're sorry, we should have. You should have trusted me. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes except Ryan's. He was still studying his plate like it contained classified information. But I understand why you didn't. I was invisible for so long you forgot I was there at all. Finally, I turned to Ryan. He looked up slowly, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not guilt exactly, recognition maybe. The look of someone who'd been caught in a lie so long he'd started believing it himself. You didn't have to erase me to be worthy, I said quietly. But you did it anyway. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. What was there to say that he'd been jealous, that he'd spent 10 years resenting me for a success he couldn't acknowledge, that he'd used our family's ignorance as a weapon against me? All of it was true. None of it was forgivable. I stood up from the table. I'm not waiting for an apology. I'm not waiting for you to explain or justify or make it right. I'm just telling you the truth, and then I'm moving on. I walked to the door, then turned back one more time. The pot roast is good. You should eat it while it's warm. I left them sitting there with the photograph and the silence and the weight of everything they'd chosen not to see. Some conversations don't need endings. They just need to be had. 6 months later, I'm back in Washington, living in the same apartment with the same view of the Potomac, but everything feels different. Not because the furniture has changed or because I've redecorated. Because I've stopped apologizing for taking up space. My work as a strategic advisor resumed without fanfare. Same security clearance, same classified briefings, same invisible influence on decisions that affect thousands of people whose names I'll never know. The difference is that now my personnel file accurately reflects what I do. Even if the operational details remain buried in classification levels that require special storage. General Thorne recommended me for a teaching position at Fort Belvoir. 1 class per month, graduate-level strategic intelligence for mid-career officers. Advanced operational analysis in asymmetric environments. The kind of course title that sounds academic until you realize it's about making life and death decisions with incomplete information. And no time for second-guessing. The first class was held in February in a conference room that smelled like coffee and floor wax, and the particular tension that comes with military personnel trying to learn something that might keep them alive. 18 students, all majors, and lieutenant colonels, all carrying the kind of confidence that comes from successful conventional careers. Melissa was in the front row. I hadn't expected her, hadn't invited her. But there she was in her navy dress uniform notepad, ready looking like any other student except for the way she watched me. Not with the careful distance of the past 10 years, but with something that looked like respect. She didn't raise her hand during the discussion periods, didn't try to make the class about us or our history or the complicated mathematics of family forgiveness. She just took notes and listened and left with the other students when the session ended. After the third class, she approached me during the break. I requested transfer to strategic communications, she said without preamble. I want to do work that matters, not just work that looks good in press releases. I nodded. It's different work, harder in some ways. I know. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I've been learning from someone who's good at it. That was as close to an apology as we were going to get, and it was enough. She attended every class after that. Always in the front row, always on time, always prepared. The other students began to notice. The Navy lieutenant colonel who never missed a session, who asked the most thoughtful questions, who stayed after to discuss theoretical applications of operational theory. By the 6th month, she was contributing to class discussions with insights that showed she was thinking beyond the textbook answers, beyond the conventional wisdom that had shaped her career up to that point. Last week, I found a plain manila folder on my desk at the Pentagon. No cover letter, no routing slip, just a strategy proposal for improving inter-service intelligence coordination during humanitarian operations. The analysis was thorough, the recommendations were practical, and the writing was clear enough for flag officers to understand and specific enough for field commanders to implement. At the bottom of the first page in Melissa's careful handwriting was one line, "I learned from the best." I read the proposal twice, checking her logic against my own experience, testing her assumptions against operational realities I couldn't discuss but could evaluate. The work was solid, more than solid. It was the kind of strategic thinking that saves lives and resources in equal measure. I signed the cover page with a single word, advance. Then I forwarded it to General Thorne with a recommendation for implementation at the theater level. Some recognition doesn't come with ceremonies or citations. Sometimes it's just one professional acknowledging another's competence, one teacher watching a student become something more than they thought possible. Sometimes the best applause is silence that means someone is finally listening. Mom calls every Sunday now. Dad sends articles he thinks I might find interesting, usually about military history or intelligence operations that have been declassified enough for civilian consumption. Ryan doesn't call, but he doesn't need to. Fort Drum is teaching him things about service that can't be learned in briefing rooms or at promotion boards. And me, I'm still doing the work that doesn't come with parades. The difference is that now I know it matters whether anyone's watching or not. The camera sits on my kitchen table, pointed toward the chair where I've been sitting for the past hour, trying to figure out how to end a story that doesn't really have an ending. Just a place where the silence stops and something else begins. I'm not wearing a uniform, haven't worn one in years, and I'm not about to start now. Just a simple gray sweater and the kind of tired that comes from carrying truth for too long. Behind me on the bookshelf, you can see the edge of a photograph if you know where to look. 3 inches by 4 inches, worn soft at the edges from handling. I press record. They told everyone I failed. I didn't argue. I just worked. My voice sounds different when I'm talking to a camera instead of to a hearing room or a family dinner table. Quieter maybe, more like the voice I use when I'm alone and don't have to perform strength for anyone else's comfort. For 10 years I let them build a story about me. The sister who couldn't finish what she started. The daughter who disappeared rather than face the challenge. The middle child who just faded away. I paused, looking directly at the camera lens. Somewhere out there, someone is listening. Someone who understands what it feels like to be erased from their own narrative. I thought silence was protection. I thought if I could just disappear completely, I could serve without the complications that come with being seen. But silence isn't protection. It's just another kind of prison, and eventually someone else gets to hold the key. I lean forward slightly the way you do when you're telling someone something important in a crowded room. The silence wasn't shame, it was duty, but now I've learned that sometimes you have to speak your name aloud. Not because you need applause, but because the truth deserves to be heard by someone other than yourself. The light from the window is starting to fade. Golden hour, photographers call it. The time when everything looks softer, more forgiving than it actually is. I saved 12 people in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. I lost 2 good men in the process. I made decisions that still keep me awake some nights, not because I regret them, but because I remember the weight of choosing who lives and who doesn't. I stopped talking for a moment, letting the silence speak for itself. Some truths need room to breathe. My family didn't know any of this. Couldn't know because the work I did existed in spaces between official records. But they could have asked questions. They could have wondered why I disappeared instead of assuming I had failed. The camera keeps recording patient in the way that only machines can be. I'm not angry anymore. Anger's just another kind of weight, and I've carried enough of that for one lifetime. I'm just tired of being invisible, tired of letting other people write the story of my life while I sit in the margins and watch. I stand up, moving toward the window where the last light of day is painting everything in shades of gold and amber. If you're still listening, if you made it this far, maybe you recognize something in this story. Maybe someone rewrote your narrative before you had the chance to live it. Maybe you've been carrying silence so long, you forgot it was a choice. The Kandahar photograph is visible now, sitting on the shelf behind where I was sitting. Proof of presence in a moment that officially never happened. If someone ever erased your story, if they decided who you were before you had the chance to show them, I pause, looking out at the street where people are walking home from work, living their visible lives under streetlights and certainty. Maybe it's time you wrote the next chapter yourself. I reach for the camera, my hand moving toward the lens. My name is Natalie Grant. I served in places where no one was watching, and I'm still here. The camera fades to black as I step outside, leaving the photograph behind on the shelf. No longer hidden, no longer a secret. Just evidence that some stories are worth telling even when they come without applause.